Hey guys, welcome back to Cyberspace Investigations. Yeah, last I checked I'm still unemployed, but frankly some problems came up, the CEO owns the company, I still own the building rights, so they couldn't really kick me out since I own the place, so they just locked me in another room. Frankly, it's right across the street from the one I was in last time, but this one's bigger, so it's frankly better. God, how am I going to get my job back? At least if I'm gonna be in the building I own, I should at least have the freedom to move around. Well, we did leave this employee handbook. Let's see what it has to say. In the event that an employee has breached the terms of employment and is kidnapped in a room, wow, really specific circumstances there, their only course of action is to marathon an entire video game series. Ha! Yeah, no, like I'm ever doing that. But you know what? That does sound like suffering. And you know what else sounds like suffering?
Sonic Omens. Dear God. Normally, I'm pretty calm, but no. I absolutely cannot be calm while describing this disgrace. You'd think that for this kind of reaction, I'd at least be talking about 06 or Rise of Lyric or something that you'd believe to be at least official, but no. We have the honor about talking about one of the worst, most idiotic, disgusting fan creations ever made for any series in existence. But first, a little background. Omens did not start out as Omens. It was first released as Sonic 2020, a demo back in, well, you guessed it, 2020, that featured a couple of levels, semi-impressive cutscenes, and okay gameplay. The real kicker wasn't anything to do with the game itself or the files, no, not yet. But instead, the creator's Patreon, Bolt, the man responsible for this atrocity, created a Patreon on which he locked beta content for the game behind a monthly paywall. Why is this bad, you may ask? Because Sega, unlike a company like Nintendo, actually lets fan games exist. AM2R got blasted off the internet just days after its launch, mostly thanks to places like Kotaku and their articles, but Sega has let hundreds of fan games stay up, even though some of them are definitely on par with what Sega themselves release, at least in the 2D department. Making a fan game paid for puts all of that at risk. Getting any monetization off of an IP you don't own puts all of those other games and creators in a very difficult position, thanks to the possible reaction Sega may have. Thankfully, Sega hasn't done anything, and I seriously doubt they will at this point, but the point still stands. Bolt put everyone at risk because he wanted to get a boost for his own career, and the worst part? The game isn't even as good as Sonic Forces! Sonic Forces!
Before I continue, I must warn the few of you that are sticking with me through this difficult time that some things I discuss ahead might be fairly graphic and disturbing to certain viewers. So, if you are sensitive in any way to questionable things having to do with children, get out.
Before we get to that, we've got to talk about the game. Now, as a Sonic fan, there are a lot of things you can be interested in, and for me, that mainly comes in the form of the story. That may seem really odd given the fact that most of the games have little to no lore. I mean, we'll see what Frontiers does, but in the current day, the lore is generally sparse outside of alternative media like the comics. Nevertheless, there is a lot to like, and a lot of deep stuff that can only be found or inferred. Omens is one of the few fan games that not only made fully animated cutscenes with voice acting, but also a coherent story. And I'm using the term coherent lightly there, as I doubt it's very much better than Shadow the Hedgehog's story. For whatever reason, Bolt decided to think that Sonic X was part of the main canon, even though it never has been, and thus worked it into a world where things like 06 Unleashed and the rest of the series afterwards are supposed to happen. The problem with this? X was never canon and never will be. Trying to tie it into the story of the main games will only give you an array of problems that Bolt, instead of dealing with, just washed away in a single monologue from Dr. Eggman. Basically, I guess sometimes after the Metarex saga, Chris Thorndike, everyone's favorite whiny child, managed to reconnect the worlds but caused his own slow death in the process. Then, without any acknowledgement, the rest of the games happen until after Unleash, where all of this stuff just comes back. There's still a Metarex guy alive named Exiled, and he's working with Gun in order to destroy everything, the universe, I don't know. Yeah, it's not the best story, but it gets worse if you look into the details. First off, as a storyteller myself, there are a lot of issues with the general plot. It wants you to know a lot of things that nobody could possibly know except for Bolt himself. Things like exactly where the game is supposed to take place, what happened before it, and the lore of both the games and Sonic X as a whole. The game just dumps you into this hugely different world from anything we're used to seeing with the Hedgehog and expects us to know it already. There are even mentions of events in the game that I can't figure out what they're referencing unless the Angel Island incident references are referring to Sonic 3, which I highly doubt. But beyond that, it's just a bad story. It has terrible pacing, villains with idiotic motivations, a melodramatic tone that's on par with Shadow the Hedgehog, lore that makes no sense, convoluted continuity, and horrible dialogue. I do have to say that the guys making this are Russian, so English isn't their first language, but I still feel like anyone could have done a better job, especially someone who is literally getting funding, unlike almost every other fan game dev on the planet. From best to worst, I think Dr. Eggman gets the best voice acting. At times, he actually sounds like a middle ground between Dean Bristow and Mike Pollock. Everyone else, however, well, let's start off with Sonic himself. The guy does an alright impersonation of Jason Griffith, but he doesn't have range. He has the same delivery when fighting a battle to save the world as he does when just getting up from a nap. There's no difference. Tails is no better, having thick Russian undertones. Shadow is literally just extremely Russian and is barely understandable. He can't even pronounce words correctly, and just... he's not really even trying to make a Shadow voice. It's just this extremely deep Russian guy talking in a normal voice. The few other characters, including Chris Thorndike, Rouge, and the announcers, are bearable, but nothing special. Even though the voice acting is pretty awful, I do have to give some props to a couple of their animations. They did have a fair grasp on how to make an entertaining scene, at least in the visual department, but it unfortunately gets overshadowed by the terrible acting and abysmal dialogue. So remember how Shadow the Hedgehog had some of the worst dialogue to ever plague a Sonic game? This is worse by miles and miles. I can't even begin to explain to you how screwed up all of this is, as the iconic line that mirrors its Morbin time in sheer terms of ridiculousness. In their final battle, Sonic flies up into the air and says,
"Consider this your bad omen!"
"Consider this your bad omen." It's just laughable. I literally laughed in the same way I did when I heard a new line from an obscure cutscene in Shadow that I hadn't come across before. Other lines aren't much better. Near the last two levels of the game, Eggman has this enormous exposition dump that blurs together as he explains all of the new lore added retroactively to the games in order to try and fit Omens in.
Thorndike was certainly ambitious. As you know, traveling to different dimensions wasn't imperfect science back then. Even for the likes of me, messing with the giving away time and space,
Eggman's voice actor really couldn't handle that much at once, I think, at least not in the first take. Speaking of that, I don't think any of these actors were allowed a second attempt. Whatever impatient nature Bolt has forced them all to do just one take in order to get all of this out on his timetable. We know this because the really bad Shadow voice wasn't even the original actor, but Bolt just couldn't wait for the guy's new microphone to come in just a couple of days. I've listened to what it would have sounded like, and while it isn't crazy good, it's so much better than any other voice in the entire game. Well, now that I've ranted about the voice acting, story, and all of that, let's get into the gameplay. It uses the Infinity Engine framework, an Unreal Engine pack that gives fully working Sonic physics and a bunch of springs and other signature objects needed to make the game. The Infinity Engine uses a version of the boost formula found in Sonic Unleashed through Forces, with small capsules increasing the boost meter. It does seem to go down way faster than the official games, but I don't think that's really a big deal if the level design is formed around it. And that's where the problem lies. Except for the first three stages, all of them are poorly constructed and not at all designed for the gameplay style necessitated by the framework they chose to use. Bolt clearly didn't like how most of Sega's Boost games are linear and straight, so he went out of his way in the complete opposite direction, making them far too open, confusing, and downright obtuse. Take Tree Palace, for example, a level played as Sonic, which is the most egregious example of non-linear gameplay in all of the episodes. It's a straight shot upwards to the goal, but the way to get there is through slow-moving platforms, buggy springs, and going underwater to hit switches in a slow and plodding manner? What the hell is this? Somehow, I think Bolt completely missed the point of Sonic gameplay, which is to be fast and rewarding with challenging platforming that you can still go fast through in order to get a high score. Here, though, the platforms move like ones would in Mario, but not even in a way something like Odyssey paces to be more entertaining. This is a problem as soon as the tutorial stage where you're forced to wait for these agonizingly slow platforms that move at 2 miles an hour. There's no really way to make this faster, you're just forced to wait. Even Frontiers, which at the moment I'm skeptical of regarding the cyberspace stages, still has a way better flow to it than what Omens created.
That has to be all, right?
No, not at all. The bosses are perhaps some of the worst I've ever seen. They have terrible attack patterns, unfair movements, and ridiculous hitboxes. You can make the camera snap over to it, but this rarely helps, and the bosses are still an absolute pain to deal with. Another thing that shows how much Bolt misunderstood Sonic game design is the Maria boss. Besides the ridiculous, idiotic, utterly stupid concept of having a Maria boss fight in the first place, he decided to turn it into a bullet hell. And not only that, but a bad one.
Who would have guessed?
But those bosses are only one half of the puzzle. The other gameplay style that appears throughout the game are the tornado stages, and dear god, they're somehow worse. So in SA1 and Unleashed, there were 2 types of tornado stages, where Tails would pilot the plane and Sonic would shoot down enemies through various means in order to complete the stage. Here, you're given full control of the plane, and it of course has awful controls. There's no beating around the bush. Bolt's obsession with creating the most open level design possible made these levels confusing, frustrating, and downright unplayable, not to mention unfair enemies, one-hit kills, and other things that should be a red flag for any game designer. So, the story's bad. The gameplay is lackluster at best and atrocious at worst, and the voice acting is laughable. So what? It's just a fan game. Looking past the questionable monetization, the game should be acceptable for a fan work, right? Oh, you thought that was it? No. So the team that works on the game, and I've mostly been calling out Bolt here because he's the main guy and the main developer that interacts with the community. So, let's go down the laundry list of things that Ouroboros has done listed in the downfall document, which you can find linked on the Sonic Woman's Twitter account.
I'll just do this all in one breath.
Stealing music, stealing assets, harassing the community, hiding their profits, slandering people, wrongfully copywriting music, a superiority complex, making fun of their own actors, dropping people at a moment's notice for idiotic reasons, exploitation, sexualizing children, monetizing their Going Bolt page, and making money off an IP they don't own, thinking they're better than Sega, and just being a bitch. If I got into what they all did in more depth, I'd be here for an extra 40 minutes, so I won't. Instead, I'll just leave you with this message. Do not, under any circumstances, support these people. Their game is bad and their practices are worse. Seriously.
Okay, was that enough? Please tell me that was enough. New memo added? No? Come on, dude! I can't review an entire game series. Fine, you know what? I created this channel, I've created this station, I created all of it. I have a dedication to making it the best that it can be. And if the only way I can get to be a part of that again is to review games, then we'll just have to come to a compromise. I will review one game. I will review one for you, CEO, and then I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you as hard as I can because you deserve it. Well, I better get to work. This game isn't gonna review itself.